Greetings, viewers. Just a couple quick videos on the relevance of Theodor Adorno to the 21st century. Adorno as the thinker of 1968. We don't usually think of Adorno in connection with activism, but we should. And one of the reasons for this is that the 60s are not what we think they were. Nowadays, we can look back at 1968 and a great moment of what Wallerstein called the anti-systemic rebellions, uprisings, revolutions. And these were a wide range of them, ranging from the civil rights insurrections and movements, all of which, by the way, to understand the radicality of the civil rights struggles in the United States, these were all movements that defied the law. They deliberately broke the law in nonviolent ways in order to protest the injustice of American apartheid and racism and segregation and other kinds of laws. And this led the way to major reforms and very positive changes in American society. Other great changes in the 50s and 60s, a wave of anti-colonial revolutions. So the colonial empires breaking apart, disrupted, not because of, and the colonial empires end not because that the people in Europe suddenly became nice and realized that colonialism was bad. Uprisings, actual uprisings had to take place to shut down these empires. And these took the form of insurgencies in Vietnam, insurgencies in Algeria for the French Empire, mass movements of civil disobedience protests in South Asia, and so on and so on and so on. And this is a struggle that went on from 1945 all the way up until 1975, when the Portuguese Empire finally falls apart through a combination of internal resistance in Portugal and external resistance in Mozambique, Angola, and so forth. So 1968 is sort of the high point of the anti-colonial resistance struggles against empire. So the majority of the planet now gets its own nation state, breaks free of the old colonial empires, and begins to start over again as independent nation states. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a huge step forwards for humanity. So Adorno is also part of that. There's a third stream, very important to mention about Adorno, and that is the folks who started to think about the classic categories of capitalism and capital in a much greater, in an enlarged context. And these were the world systems theorists. Immanuel Wallerstein is the classic example. There are many others. And their basic point was they were thinking through a lot of the things that Marx was thinking through, but now finally they had good data sets to actually look and back up those insights with actual data to think through the connections. And what I would argue is this, what Adorno gives us for rethinking this period of history. And I'll go out on a limb here, and by the way, I'm not making any kind of, this is not a word game, there's no trickery here, but I actually want you to think about this paradox. The limit point of all the wonderful things that Karl Marx gave us in the 19th century. He gives us an incredible set of tools to understand the world, but there's a limit to his thinking. He'd be the first to acknowledge this. And that limit was his critique was a theory of British capital. It was not, and it could not have been, a theory of British capitalism. The data to support a theory of capitalism was not there yet. Marx didn't have access to he couldn't do field work in India, he couldn't see the mechanisms, all this work had to happen for us to figure out how the capitalisms emerged over time from various other configurations. So what he had was, and the title, of course, of Capital is a critique of political economy, but it was really a theory of British capital, a singular space and a singular form of domination, the single most powerful capitalism of the 19th century, hegemonic, but not the only one. What Adorno and the world systems theorists and the civil rights struggles and the anti-colonial movements all together are helping us to think. That's the moment that human beings start to create an actual theory of transnational capitalism. Now, there's a basic sociological reality underlying this, and that is the regions of the world back in 1867, when Marx was around and did the first edition of Capital, capitalism was quite small. So the number of people that were fully waged laborers or partly waged laborers, who were not peasant producers, were still a very small percent of all of humanity. As late as the 1960s, 1970s, at least 60% of people on the planet were peasant farmers. A very tenuous connection to capitalism. I mean, they existed in a capitalist hegemony. Capital was hegemonic, but they didn't live consumerism, markets, money as an everyday reality until sort of later in the historical period. It's actually not until the 1980s, and definitely by the 1990s, that a majority of human beings actually become proletarianized. And this is a major change in the world systems. The exact moment where Marx is completely forgotten in the early 90s and no one is paying attention to him, that's actually the moment that his categories come true. His point is, this British capital is going to turn into something else and we should rise up and resist it. But what happened was it turned into a transnational capitalism. First an American version, and now, of course, a genuinely transnational capitalism. It covers the entire planet these days. Nowadays, by the way, the latest estimate is that only 26% of human beings, and 26% are agricultural laborers living on farms. And of course, even of those farmers, most of them are very tightly integrated into markets and experience the market as an everyday thing, have smartphones and so forth. So the 21st century is the century of the transnational proletariat. And that is where all of Adorno's concepts are incredibly powerful tools of anti-capitalist resistance.